Hello and welcome to our podcast. I am Hannah.
I'm Becca.
I'm Gabby.
And I'm Gemma. For this project, what we were hoping to do was study some moments of change in history and to analyze how did it even happen. And when we were discussing what moment we wanted to focus on, we wanted to find one that was seemingly a relatively easy change, something that didn't take a lot of work on the surface and was something that progressed really quickly. And we wanted to do so we could study how those strategies and how that even happened could be applied to other contexts to make things easier, to make those moments of change easier. And so that is when we landed on the legalization of gay marriage in the Netherlands.
So this story concludes in 2001 when gay marriage became law. But prior to this, we found that both the history of social norms, political context, and the legal status of homosexuality was really interesting and important to understanding the context. So starting with legal, in the 19th century, in in 1811, homosexuality, sodomy specifically, was decriminalized under Napoleonic law. The French system enforced the separation of church and state, under which sexual relationships were deemed the private business of citizens and was beyond state regulation. Then, 100 years later, in 1911, homosexuality was recriminalized um, under the rule of Christian political parties, and the Napoleonic law was amended to specifically criminalize same-sex relationships between those between the age of 16 and 21. And then jumping forward a little bit, in 1971, homosexuality was once again legally decriminalized for those all at the age of consent. And 1994, the Dutch Equal Treatment Act was passed following 16 years of debate in Parliament, and this provided legal protection against discrimination based on gender, ethnicity, or sexual preference. 1997, the government began taking concrete steps towards legalizing same-sex marriage, and a commission led by Professor C.J.M. Klassen was formed to draft relevant legislation. 1998, the Netherlands introduced registered partnerships for same-sex and opposite-sex couples. This provided similar rights and responsibilities to marriage, but it was legally distinct. And then in 2000, a bill to amend the Dutch Civil Code to allow same-sex marriage was introduced to Parliament by the coalition government. The legal argument was advocated that the bill was consistent with Article 1 of the Dutch legal constitution, which prohibits discrimination, and the Parliament voted for the outcome of 109 votes in favour and 33 against. It was then passed through the Senate, in which 94 voted in favour and 26 against. So now we'll look at a bit more of the social norms. In the 19th century, back again, homosexuality was still deeply stigmatized, although technically legal or decriminalized, I guess. And then also psychiatric studies began to develop and look into that aspect of homosexuality. And then kind of later on in the 19th century, movements for individual freedom and secularism began, which became very important to the movement. Um, Quite significantly, in 1946, the Dutch LGBTQ rights organization, COC, was founded, and it was one of the oldest LGBTQ plus advocacy groups in the world, initially focused on decriminalization and social acceptance, so not initially focused on gay marriage, but more on decriminalization. And then 1964, the Dutch Reformed Church kind of starts debating homosexuality, and this kind of signified a shift in religious attitudes. And then in the 80s, there was increasing visibility of LGBTQ plus groups in Dutch society, supported by the work of COC and other advocacy groups, which shifted public opinion towards greater tolerance. And in 1987, the establishment of the annual Amsterdam Gay Pride, which became a prominent platform for raising awareness about LGBTQ rights. This also coincided with response to AIDS crisis, which definitely brought a lot of publicity to the gay rights movement. Then in 1995, public opinion surveys indicated majority support for legal recognition of same-sex relationships, saying societal norms had shifted in favor of equality. And then between 1999 and 2000, media coverage of parliamentary debates on same-sex marriage was largely neutral or supportive, reflecting social acceptance. And then in 2001, when the first same-sex marriages were performed, public reaction was overwhelmingly positive, and the event was celebrated as a milestone in the Netherlands' commitment to equality. And then finally, looking at the political, the 1980s saw a lot of social progress. The dominance of Christian democratic parties had consistently opposed same-sex marriage and other LGBTQ rights, and the CDA's influence prevented serious parliamentary debate on marriage equality during this period. But in 1986, the first motion on same-sex marriage was introduced by left-wing parties, and although it was not adopted, it marked the beginning of serious political discussions on marriage equality. In 1989, the coalition government formed between the CDA and the Labour Party, who had made the recognition of same-sex relationships part of its policy platform. This helped to normalise this issue within mainstream politics. In 1994, there was a general election. The CDA suffered significant losses, leading to its exclusion from government for the first time in decades. The Purple Coalition was formed under Prime Minister Wim Kok, comprising of the Labour Party, Democrat 66, and the People's Party for Freedom of Democracy. And the Democrat 66 specifically pushed for marriage equality as part of the coalition agreement. In 95, the government commissioned the Scientific Council for Government Policy to study the legalization of same-sex marriage. And then in 2000, the motion to legalize gay marriage passed in Parliament. And although there was opposition from Christian parties, the bill passed, and as they lacked the political influence to block it. And then even when Christian parties returned to government, they were unable to reverse the act due to high public support for it. So that's kind of a rundown of the context.
So this leads us to one of the most major critical junctures that we identified in this case. So the 1994 election meant that the Christian Democratic Appeal was no longer in power, and that was for the first time in 76 years. This meant that the new coalition, the Purple Coalition, was a more progressive, more left-wing party that was in power. But historically, left-wing governments in Europe were not enough to change same-sex union laws. And this is further clarified by the fact that even though the Purple Coalition was elected in 94, it took 6 years to introduce legislation to legalize same-sex marriage in 2000. So this change could not have come at this time without a critical change in party leadership, but at the same time, this is not the only reason alone. And further this, we're going to dive into who are the actors and who are the stakeholders that were really pushing for this change.
So stakeholders, who are the drivers, who are the opponents, who is important to this change? And this is a tool that we learned in our advocacy course. Essentially what you're doing is you're just mapping out who is everybody involved. And then from there, you have this called a 2x2 grid. And what you're measuring on the y-axis is the level of influence. So what is the level of influence this person has? Is it minimal, or a group of people? Is it grand? And then on the x-axis, going back to math, you have what is the level of agreement that they have with what you are trying to change. So I'm going to just explain the role and how it changed with a few key stakeholders. Going back to what has already been said earlier, the Netherlands had been seen, especially in Amsterdam, as like this hub for LGBTQIA+ rights, and very much holding on to this legacy. It was actually quite easy to find who were the proponents for gay marriage legalization, but it was harder to find who were the opponents. So starting with the prominent proponents, you have Henk Krol, that came up again and again in our research. And Henk Krol was a leading gay rights activist among an already quite activist community. And what set him apart from others was truly diving into this issue of wanting to legalize gay marriage. For other advocacy groups, they did not see legalizing gay marriage as important. In fact, wanted to abolish the concept of marriage altogether, seeing it as incredibly heteronormative. But Henk Krol distinguished himself and actually wrote a letter called The Gay Grant, which was a highly popular magazine that covered everything from politics to also entertainment, but also did talk about advocating for gay rights, including the right to legalization for marriage. And alongside with that, we have the Purple Coalition, as previously mentioned. This is a more left-wing government. This is the first time the CDA, or the Christian Party, was no longer part of the ruling coalition. And again, studying opponents with that, what came up in the research was Christian population being against it. But when the first gay marriages were conducted in Amsterdam in April, there was a total of 7 protesters standing outside the courthouse, which is not very many protesters at all. So much of the opposition, if you think about it like an iceberg, was below water and it wasn't that visible. Because why would it that suddenly CPA not being part of the ruling coalition would allow this massive change to happen so quickly? And another stakeholder identified that is powerful, but for all intents of our purposes, kind of incredibly neutral, is the Dutch Supreme Court. So originally, Henk Krol found this ambiguity in marriage code laws and made a lawsuit. It eventually goes up to the Dutch Supreme Court, and in this ambiguity, it was trying to say that you can have legalization of marriage between the same sexes, and the Dutch Supreme Court said, there's no ambiguity here. They didn't, again, rule against it, but ruled against the ambiguity itself. And what this does, it places the responsibility of legalization of gay marriage directly to the parliament. And so what was quite interesting, and what you have the movement, is Henk Krol really starts to gain steam on this advocacy work. The COC, another prominent activist group for gay rights, eventually joins him. And as Gemma said earlier, just because you have the election of a left-wing government does not mean that all of a sudden all these left-wing or more left-seeming laws take into place or account. And so you actually have you have 2 different municipalities that threatened the Purple Coalition when they were elected, because there was this time gap between them being elected and actually enacting or going through with this law. And they said, if you don't pass this or you don't put it on the table, we're going to conduct these marriages anyway. And so what that led to was called the Courtman Commission. So on this 2x2 grid, imagine them really high up on the y-axis, a lot of influence, but right directly neutral. And this commission was to say, what are the implications of legalizing gay marriage through strictly a legal lens? And I think about a year later, the publication came out saying, this is perfectly fine. There will be absolutely no change, all good to go from here. And then that was almost like the straw that broke the camel's back. Okay, there's no excuse anymore. We have to legalize this and continue. And so when you have what we learned in class, when you have the stakeholder map, the stakeholders ultimately move after the change, right? Proponents for something become more influential. Opponents become less influential. Over time, you can have greater agreement towards what the change was. And you can somewhat see that, or that did happen within the Netherlands. Henk Krol, I think, is either currently an MP right now and is now like one of a world famous activists on the world stage. You have the Christian Democratic Appeal for that time having less influence. You have, again, it was hard to find opponents, but you have opponents kind of being a bit delegitimized or like less influence and greater agreement overall. And you have the municipalities that were threatening the coalition to have greater influence. And in fact, it was interesting, the Courtman Commission, the one that said this legalization is perfectly fine, the leader of the Courtman Commission is actually now a prominent gay rights activist as well.
So now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the tactics that were used to help legalize gay marriage. So we have all these actors, but what did they actually do to push for gay marriage, and why were the tactics they used so successful? And like Gemma talked about at the beginning, why did it create almost this seemingly seamless process? I mean, there were definitely bumps, but compared to some of the other places that we looked at, the Netherlands really seemed to have this much more linear process than other places. So, just as a general overview, to legalize gay marriage, the Dutch emancipation movement had to achieve 3 key objectives. They had to shift social norms around homosexuality. They had to advocate for more than just civil partnerships because, like everyone talked about a little bit earlier, this idea of civil partnerships was kind of coming to the surface as, yeah, this is enough. But if we wanted to legalize gay marriage, civil partnerships would not be enough. And the third thing that had to happen was they actually had to change the law around gay marriage. So there were lots of different tactics that were employed to achieve these aims. So first, talking about shifting social norms around homosexuality, the importance of this was that social norms had to be shifted in order to help create the cultural backing required for policy change. So there's just this idea that the majority of the population, especially in a democracy, should be for an idea in order for policymakers to want to enact it into law. What were the tactics used to actually shift these social norms? So the first was the creation of the COC, and the COC, like we talked about a little bit before, was this big kind of gay rights advocacy group. So what the COC really did was it kind of allowed gay rights advocacy to come to the forefront and become normalized. They did this by organizing marches, and they partnered with other youth and feminist groups, which really harnessed this power with and allowed lots of groups to come together in this kind of idea that there were many people supporting this movement, and that was really powerful in shifting social norms because it became more normalized through the help of the COC. The other thing that really helped shift social norms was targeting the church because that seemed to be one of the biggest opponents of gay marriage. And what happened was that religious figures within the church actually said and preached to their congregation that gay marriage is something that should be normalized, homosexuality is something that is totally okay. And then this kind of insider influence from within the church really allowed gay marriage to kind of become normalized within society. The next thing that was really important was mass communication. So if something is not talked about, then it's not going to seem very normal. But if something is talked about a lot, then it's going to become much more normalized. There was lots of mass communication over radio shows and other kind of public broadcasting networks, which really normalized the discussion of gay marriage. So why were these tactics especially successful? We touched about it a little bit, but we'll just go into it a little bit more depth. So all of these tactics really harness the power of collectivity. So whether it be the COC, the church, or the public broadcasting, it really brought a lot of people the idea that gay marriage was something that should be a right and that marriage equality should be a right. And this kind of created this collective power where the more people that were bandwagon onto an idea, the more convincing it became. The reason that using religious figures worked really, really well, and we kind of talked about this a little bit before too, was that it was really working within a knowledge base and working within kind of meeting people where they were at. So it took basically one of the biggest opponents to legalizing gay marriage and said, actually, there are people within your system that do think that gay marriage should be legalized. And once that kind of became normalized within the system, it made it much easier to kind of spread through the biggest opponent, which was the church. So it was a really, really effective point of entry. And then finally, the creation of the COC was also really important because it not only kind of made this big coalition where people could come in and show collective solidarity, but also it really formalized people's ability to act, which was also super important because you could have all these individual activists and you could have a lot of them, but if they weren't able to formally act through things like marches, then there wouldn't necessarily be a big push through the kind of activist network that came with the creation of the COC. So it really allowed them to formalize their power. Next, when we talk about advocating for civil partnerships, that was an aim that the emancipation movement had to achieve. And this was really, really important because there were some groups within the LGBTQ plus movement that we talked about earlier, like the COC, that they believed themselves that civil partnerships were enough. And if these movements, especially kind of these insider groups within the LGBTQ plus community, said that this was okay, then there wouldn't necessarily be a need to push for more. So it was really important that we kind of created this idea, or that activists created this idea that civil partnerships weren't where we should stop. We should keep pushing beyond that. So what were the tactics used to shift social norms around civil partnerships? So the first thing that was done was, again, really spearheaded by Hank Kroll, that when he kind of came on board with the idea of civil partnerships not being the line that we should draw, he actually went to the government and said, hey, let's move beyond this. And this was something that was really important because no one had actually had this direct ask, right? Because there was already this idea and social norm that civil partnerships were enough. And he kind of went and said, no, I'm actually going to go right to the government and say that this isn't enough. So that was really important in shifting social norms. The other thing that was also really important to shifting these social norms around civil partnerships was having broader coalitions like the COC, like municipalities, and like Gay Grant, the magazine that Hank Kroll ran, actually come in and say, yeah, we're all going to band together, all these really important groups, and say that this is not enough. So that was something that was really important. And we're going to talk about some of the things that the municipalities specifically did a little bit later, and that was really important. Yeah, one of the things that they did was they threatened people. And that was really, really important that the municipalities actually threatened to go against the state, like Gabby talked about a little bit earlier, and said, yeah, if you don't do this, then we're just gonna do these marriages in our municipalities, whether or not you agree with it as a national government or not. And that was really, really important too, and kind of an interesting tactic that they brought up. So why were these tactics so successful? So municipalities and Hank Kroll advocated for change to visible power through their access to closed invited spaces. So one thing that a lot of these groups did was that they actually were able to use their status as insiders to access government spaces, which is really, really interesting. So that's kind of what the municipalities and Hank Kroll did, was that when the municipalities said, yeah, we're going to perform these marriages anyways, they were using their ability as an insider to advocate in these closed spaces. And Hank Kroll was really interesting because he himself was a journalist, and he said that his ability specifically to go into these invited spaces, these invited in closed spaces, was because he was a journalist. So he was actually invited in, and that's kind of why he was able to go and do these direct asks. The next thing that they did was that made these tactics really, really successful was that they used the system against lawmakers. So they did a lot of shaming and threats, and that came specifically from the municipalities. This is really important because especially when you're living in a democracy, if you have some of your other governments saying, hey, what you're doing is wrong, and especially in a place like the Netherlands where kind of they're trying to position themselves as this really progressive social country, if there are other municipalities that are saying, yeah, what you're doing isn't actually so progressive, this is kind of shameful, and is made the municipality, or sorry, and then made the national government kind of want to shift more into this idea of legalizing gay marriage. The next thing was that the COC and Greg Grant used their insider influence in the LGBTQ plus community to shift invisible power of social norms around civil partnership. So what they kind of came in and said, yeah, we as a COC and we as Gay Grant and also as Hank Kroll as part of Gay Grant have this ability to work within the LGBTQ plus community that may think that civil partnerships is enough, and we have the ability to kind of go in and say, yeah, maybe it's not. So they kind of use their advocacy strategies as insiders within the LGBTQ plus community to make a difference. The other thing that was really important and why all these tactics were really successful is because they channeled power with. So all of these tactics really engaged lots of people from the top down with municipalities, from the bottom up, engaging the LGBTQ plus community and Hank Kroll. So they created a lot of political pressure from lots of different angles, which is why they were really successful in shifting the social norm. So the last aim that they had to achieve was they had to change the law. So they actually had to legalize gay marriage in the Netherlands. So what did they do to shift this law and actually bring it into practice? Was they used a lot of evidence to show that a lot of the Dutch people, like we kind of talked about earlier, were really for the legalization of gay marriage. And again, as the Netherlands is kind of trying to position itself as a progressive country, it's also a democracy. If a lot of your people say, yeah, we want this to happen, it kind of looks bad if you don't make it happen. So the people that found this evidence was Hank Kroll, again, one of our main activists in this area of change. What he did was he actually did this big mass poll where he went and he kind of collected data, and then he brought that again to the government to say, hey, look, most people in the Netherlands are in support of gay marriage. Another thing that was really, really important was a bunch of legal advocacy. There were 3 people whose names I will not try and pronounce, but there were a lot of really, really strong lawyers who really, really understood the system and argued from a human rights approach that gay marriage needed to be legalized. And again, this is a really, really important tactic because it kind of shamed the government, basically saying, yeah, you're breaking human rights, or you're kind of not appealing to proper human rights if we don't have marriage equality. And as the Netherlands, as this progressive country, this doesn't really look great. And that was a really powerful tactic. So let's just go into a little bit more depth about why these were successful. First, the use of evidence provided tangible proof of a societal want for change. Again, really, really important in a democracy. The use of a human rights-based approach to help to contextualize the issue and shift the informal and systemic issues of social norms. And finally, the driven insiders with resources were really, really important. So the lawyers that were there were insiders. They were kind of part of the want to make gay marriage legal. They were also insiders, and they had these resources. So those three things really can't, even though they just seem kind of like a given, they can't really go unnoticed. That the lawyers who were advocating for this were really passionate about it, and they were really able to kind of use the legal system to their advantage and understand how to advocate for this approach. So that was super, super important in legalizing gay marriage.
So this then leads us back to the question of why was Netherlands the first country to legalize gay marriage? We've established that there was an incredible history of progressive social norms and attitudes changing around queer rights. We saw the critical juncture of the Purple Coalition coming into power. We saw there's so many individuals and organizations, stakeholders pushing for this progress for numerous decades. And we see a variety of tactics being used by both insiders and outsiders to shift these norms. But this was happening in a few countries in various different ways. So in order to figure out why was Netherlands first, we have to look beyond the borders, and we have to try and investigate what's going on in the area. So the first thing to know is that Netherlands was always close to the forefront of progress on queer rights. So while never being the first country, for example, to legalize same-sex partnership, they were still quite close to being one of the first. So Denmark was the first country leading the way for registered partnership laws. That was in 1989. And closely following was the Netherlands in 1998 as the fifth country to legalize registered partnerships. Some of the countries in between are Norway, Sweden, and Iceland. And as you can see, countries are learning from each other and adapting laws to suit their own context. So for example, back in the 70s, Sweden opened up the idea of registered partnerships for any couple who wanted a less institutionalized form of union. And Denmark, they were the one to take that law and to reframe it as for just being for same-sex partnerships in 1989. So starting in 89 onwards, Denmark was really using their status as the first country to legalize registered partnerships to emphasize the role of the teacher. And activists in the Netherlands were really seeing this as an opportunity to do something similar within the Netherlands. This leads us to the second point, which is the establishment of a European policy community. So as we can see, there's a whole bunch of countries within Northwestern Europe that were forming this sort of policy community around progressive social policy. This was also formalized through the LGBT European policy community that was really contributing towards shifting the norms around queer policy progression. This means that countries within this space were learning from each other and teaching each other some of the best practices for progressing queer policy. This allowed countries to experiment slightly with policy, with the recognition that they were not going to be alone for very long if they were to experiment with some form of policy creation. But this point also means that any country within this policy community could have been one to take this leap and to be the first to legalize same-sex marriage. So that's when we get into some of the advocacy that activists within the Netherlands were using during this time. So as you can see, the Netherlands saw this and they took advantage of the opportunity to be a policy pioneer. So they saw that they could be on the cutting edge of queer rights policy and be able to make a name for themselves on the world stage. And marriage advocates within the Netherlands, they saw this opportunity. They took on the point of view of the government and they used this as a tool to push for the implementation of policy. Essentially, we can see this through some of the reflection from members of the Christian Democratic Appeal about 8 years later in 2009. One of their members had the quote, "The main view in this country was we want to be modern, we want to be progressive, and we will lead the world. We wanted to be the first." So this really demonstrates that this was a perspective that was taken closer to 2000 by members of the government. They were finally starting to recognize that there is a benefit to being the first, to being a policy pioneer, and they wanted to take this opportunity. And as we can see from some of the countries that followed, others also saw this opportunity for middle countries building their normative power. So for some of the countries that followed, they had similar positions on the world stage. We see Belgium, Spain, Canada, South Africa, and other members of the European policy community, such as Norway, Sweden, Iceland, following suit in the years after 2001. So ultimately, this leads us back to our overall argument. It was not just any one thing that led to this change. Although it's seemingly an easy change to legalize same-sex marriage within the Netherlands, we can see that there were so many factors that were coming into play here. So as we can see here, there are 4 major things coming together to lead to the legalization of same-sex marriage in the Netherlands. So first up is the social history. The Netherlands was historically at the forefront of social acceptance and queer rights and same-sex marriage. So they were consistently near the forefront of progress on same-sex marriage. Secondly, that's followed by decades of activism. So individuals, organizations such as Henk Krol and the COC mobilizing for decades around same-sex marriage, civil partnerships, and other queer rights, building power with and norm shifting during that time. Then we see the political change, which was the critical juncture of the Christian Democratic Appeal no longer being in power, and the new Purple Coalition, which was more left-leaning, taking power. And then finally, we see that final push of being a policy pioneer and the appeal that had for the government in the Netherlands to make a name for themselves, build their soft power through taking a new policy position within a favorable international environment. So all of these factors coming together led to the Netherlands being the first country to legalize same-sex marriage. And taking away from this, we want to reflect a little bit more as to the broader importance of analyzing this change. So 2 major things come out from the legalization of gay marriage and our analysis of how this even came about that we think could be applied to other contexts. So the first is favorable environments need work. What we saw initially as an easy point of change and as a really favorable social and political environment for this change, it took decades. It took decades of work from so many different actors to create that environment to make the law pass easily, in quotations. And secondly, we see using national reputation as a tool. So this could be used in a variety of ways, but within the Netherlands, this was used by same-sex marriage activists in order to use comparison, competition, and normative or soft power as a tactic to push their government in order to make this policy change.
Hopefully, this presentation provides an overview of the multiple moving parts behind how the Netherlands legalized gay marriage. It is through the analysis of moments of change that we can pull out what works to apply to the moments of change that we're living in right now. For more information on this topic, please check out these sources.